Thank you very much. I'm excited to be back at Fargo Baptist. I remember I was here when you were in the other building somewhere else. And then I was here when this wing was the first building and the first auditorium. And I spoke in here before any of that existed. So I go back a little ways, and I'm always excited to get to be able to come back here. The message I'm giving this morning is available on DVD with all the graphics. The DVDs are me speaking. The graphics, like you see, come up on the screen, come up on the TV screen as you watch it. Dr. David Gibbs told about the impact. I'm going to have to leave several things out to get this message in. So when you see the slides just sort of go by, you'll know that's what I'm doing. Dr. David Gibbs has been here before. He may have told this story here. He told about the impact his paternal grandfather, Earl Gibbs, had on his life. He said, my grandfather on my dad's side was not a well-educated man. He left school in the 5th grade because he declined to repeat it for the 3rd time. About the only thing he knew how to do was butcher a cow. But by the time I came along, my father and grandfather were butchering 5,000 to 7,000 cattle a week, putting them in semis and sending them everywhere. My granddad didn't know much, but he knew how to give 1,000 men a full-time job, and his prayers changed my life. He would always do 2 things when he would pray. The first thing he would do is say, God, this is Earl. Then he would say, and God, you know that I lack. And that prayer was based on James 1:5, where God said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth it to all men liberally. Granddad said to me, David, with all your talent and education, if you're not careful, you'll get comfortable living on what you can produce, and all of a sudden, you will no longer have heaven-sent wisdom. My granddad called me into his office one day and said, I've got a job for you to do, David. He said, I've been praying over these purchases we made. We bought this farmer's cattle too cheap. I said, Grandpa, we didn't buy those cattle too cheap. We just stole them at auction. I bid, nobody else bid. We didn't do anything wrong. And he looked at me and said, David, that's not how a Christian does it. You want somebody to buy your cattle too cheap? No. Then don't you ever do it to anybody else. We are to do to them what we would want them to do to us. I've put money in this envelope. I want you to travel to their farm. I want you to get there before they go to bed tonight. It was in Ohio. It was the dead of winter. The house was 300 miles away. You tell them we're sorry. We don't do this to people. We wouldn't want anybody to do this to us. He hands me this envelope, and I said, how much money is in here, Grandpa? And I'll share more of that story later. My key verse is Proverbs 17:6. Read it off the screen with me, everybody. Would you please all together? Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. This is one of 10 times that phrase, children's children, occurs in your Bible, and 6 times God refers to your son, and those phrases are God's way of referring to grandchildren. The first half of Proverbs 17:6, children's children are the crown of old men, is looking at life from the perspective of the old grandfather. The second half, the glory of children of their fathers, is looking at life from the perspective of the grandchild. And it's saying that a grandparent can wear a crown of respect and honor if he will make right choices in relation to his grandchildren. Children's children are the crown of old men. The crown is not his wealth or social status or house or land or car. It is not how successful he was in the business world. The rest of the verse says, the glory of children are their fathers. And the word fathers is plural, referring to more than one generation. It means that when fathers and grandfathers together make wise, righteous choices in relation to their children and grandchildren, that those children don't just enjoy their relationship with those men, they glory in those relationships. The first time that Hebrew word translated glory occurs is in Exodus 28:2, and it was referring to the beauty of the garments of the high priest of Israel. Just like the high priest of Israel's garment, set him apart as someone unique and special. So a child's proper relationship with his dad and grandpas make him or her feel that they are someone very unique and special. I believe that every grandparent, especially every grandfather, should humbly seek to be the kind of man that God would allow to wear the crown that God talks about in this verse. Now I want to take that word crown, C-R-O-W-N, and use it as an acrostic to communicate key Bible truths to all grandparents about the crowning privileges of a grandparent. The letter C, commit yourself to making a positive spiritual impact on the life of each grandchild. Just like God chose parents for their children and children for their parents, so God also chose grandparents for their grandchildren and grandchildren for their grandparents. And God gave commands and instructions to grandparents. God said, only take heed to thyself and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life. But teach them thy sons and thy son's son. Whatever God has taught you and me about His Word and truth and wisdom and God and life itself, we're given the responsibility to pass that on to our children and our grandchildren. Think, what do you know about God and His Word that your grandchildren don't know? God says plainly, teach them. Now you might say, well, I don't know how to teach. The truth is, there's never a time when you're around your children and grandchildren that you are not teaching them. You're teaching with your words and with your life. Notice what is not an option for a grandparent: to follow the world's culture and laughingly say, well, I raised my kids, now they can raise their kids. Our culture actually subtly encourages grandparents to retreat from life and spend their later years playing. The moment you say or think that way, you cut yourself and your grandchildren off from the blessings that God has planned for both of you. None of us may be able to stop ourselves from entering our second childhood. We should not go there on purpose. Retire from your job if you must. Never retire from life. Larry Fowler wrote a grandparenting declaration. He said, I am an intentional Christian grandparent. Culture says retire and go play, and I say no thanks, I'll pray. Culture says pursue affluence, and I say I will pursue influence. Culture says you're old and you did your time. I say not so, I'm in my prime. Culture says those young generations, you can't relate. I say that it ain't true. My influence is great. I've heard grandparents laughingly, jokingly say they're called grandchildren because it's grand when they come and it's grand when they leave. And you know what? What if your grandchildren have heard you say that and something happens and they have to come and live with you? And you would have to apologize to them, or that one statement would indelibly ruin their relationship with you. Over and over when grandchildren come to my house, I say to them, we are so glad you're at Papa and Grandma's house. You will always find a warm bed and good food and lots of love here. Many grandchildren, I'm talking about committing to make a positive spiritual impact on the life of each grandchild. Many grandchildren have had their lives ruined by grandparents who encouraged their children away from God and God's truth. I read about a young adult female comedian who was raised by her grandma, and she said, Grandma allowed me to be funny. If I told a dirty joke, she would laugh. She nurtured that. Another article about Walt Heyer. When he was 4 years old, his grandmother was his babysitter, also a seamstress. She decided to make him a dress. He said, she put me in that dress and began to fawn over me and tell me how cute I was as a little girl, and it started confusion in me concerning who I was. When his mother found out about the dress, Walt was forbidden to visit Grandma's house again, But he said the damage was done. Add to his story an abusive father, and when Walt became an adult, the poor, confused man decided to try to become a woman. Later, he said, I was rescued by Jesus from my transgender life. One of the saddest things we deal with in our ministry is parents who have had to separate their children from grandparents because the grandparents mock and scorn the beliefs of the Christian grandparents. Then there are other grandparents who may be Christians, but they don't honor the wishes of the children's parents. I love the picture we have of several generations all together, but it's also true that each one of my daughters and sons-in-law have their own family, and I should honor the wishes of those parents. If their parents don't want them to have candy or soda, they're not going to come to our house and get it. If their parents want them in bed at a certain time, we're going to try to honor that. Read with me off the screen, would you please, everybody? You can't properly influence if you're undermining. Also, sadly, there are some grandparents who just don't care. They have the opportunity to leave their mark, and they just don't take it. Think about this. I'm not doing my adult children a favor by babysitting their children. They're doing me a favor by letting me do so. When the kids call us and need us to help with the grandchildren, we try to always say yes. It is not a responsibility. It is a privilege. It is a key reason we are alive right now. A lady wrote an advice column, and she said, for the last 30 years, my family has lived 1,500 miles from my mother. I visit her every 2 or 3 years and call often, but the last time my mother visited us was 28 years ago. Mom's in good health, and we get along fine. Every time I talk to her, I invite her to come and see us. She always says she has no interest. Our daughter's getting married soon, and called her. I offered to pay for the trip, even though she could afford it. She will leave her house and go on long trips. And she told a relative she hadn't come into the wedding because she doesn't want to. Now, that grandmother is cheating her granddaughter, but she is also cheating herself. Grandparents, you are going to leave your mark. God has given you the power of influence, and it's an extraordinary power. A grandparent, if they've been doing what they should be doing, has been growing their influence for many years. Watch my hands right here, would you please? I want to show you the difference between control and influence. Control over a child is 100% at birth, and then it gets less and less every day until about age 20. I have a whole message on the subject of what God expects from a 20-year-old. Once a child becomes an adult, control ceases. What takes its place? Influence is also 100% at birth, and yet, amazingly, influence never has to cease. Influence can actually grow. I don't know how you grow past 100%, but you can. And if you fight for control, when God means for you to use influence instead, you can actually damage your influence. The good thing about influence is that it can keep going and growing for the rest of life and even after life is over. I read about a t-shirt that was really talking about the power of a grandmother's influence. It said, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. If grandma ain't happy, run. You will either leave your mark negatively or, write that one down, Brother Skeving, all right? Or positively. There is very little in between. Your absence, when you should be present, leaves a negative mark. That's why my wife and I try our best to be at every grandchild's birthday party or graduation or whatever it is. I'm so glad my children will actually call and say, Dad, are you going to be here on this date? We want to have a birthday party, and they include us in that. I believe in going to church. I believe if I don't go to church, my grandchildren will be negatively affected spiritually by my example. But if I don't attend a birthday party, that can have a negative spiritual impact as well. One of the things I've said to each of my grandchildren for many years now is, if I didn't have a granddaughter just like you, I'd wish I did. And if I didn't have a grandson just like you, I'd wish I did. Listen to me, Grandpa and Grandma. Don't play favorites. Favoritism says to all the other children that they're inferior. It is not loving like Christ loves us. I understand why grandparents do it, but it doesn't make it right. Some grandchildren are easier to love than others. With some, you just have this connection. They just steal your heart. But when you treat a grandchild differently, it causes their siblings or cousins to sense rejection or worse. I've seen times when grandparents, by the way, the harshest language of the soul from one person to another is rejection. I've seen times when grandparents were just plain mean to a grandchild, deliberately pinching or hurting or tripping the grandchild they didn't like. The only thing worse than a teenage bully is an old age bully. It's more difficult to correct older people. You would not believe how many times I've stopped at my kids' and grandkids' house, even though I was tired and wanted to go home and rest. I can rest when I get to heaven. I cannot be with my grandchildren anymore after I get to heaven. The thought of making a positive spiritual impact on my grandchildren is a powerful motivation to cause me to just want to stay alive. When I had a heart attack right after my 60th birthday and my grandchildren were coming in my hospital room, I could see in their faces, we're about to lose our grandpa. And I told one of my granddaughters in that room, I promise you I will do everything in my power to be at your wedding someday. I'm close to all my grandchildren. I stepped down after 36 years of pastoring and started traveling and preaching so I could be there for my wife and my kids and grandkids. I've even changed my diet somewhat so I can live longer. I even thought about giving up pecan pie. But pecan pie is almost worth dying for, folks, all right? I'm just kidding. My wife and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last year, and I wanted us to play a slide presentation and redo our vows, and the main reason was I wanted to say to my grandchildren, you can do this. We take grandchildren with us when we travel. Their parents allow us and want us to do this. The grandkids take at least one driving trip with us and one flying trip in the 48 continental United States. Most of them have taken multiple driving trips with us. And then we hope to take all of them to some foreign country. I took Judah to Europe and Joshua and Caleb to Trinidad and Danielle and Janae on separate trips to Ireland. I got 5 down and 9 to go, and I'm 69. I don't know how that's going to go. According to Mark 3:14, Jesus chose disciples that they should be with Him. I want my grandchildren to be with me, not just doing things I want to do, but things they want to do as well. I talked to a missionary who was serving in a remote village in Alaska, and he had heard this message that explains your top priority is not a ministry, it is relationships, and they have to be in the proper order with God first, your mate next, your children and grandchildren next. And he was wondering what he could do, and I told him to Skype on a regular basis and have the grandchildren come and visit as much as he could. Do you think about this? Do you plan for this? One of the greatest illustrations that I know of this point was given to me by my friends, Evangelist and Mrs. Maury Gibson. Brother Gibson, I was so impressed with what he does, I asked him to write it out, and here's what he said. God's blessed us with 6 children who all serve the Lord, and He's blessed us with 23 grandchildren, and they're all scattered across the country in 5 different states. We visit each family several times a year, and we all get together at Christmas. In 2005, we wanted to do something to allow our grandchildren to spend time with each other and also to allow us as grandparents to have some quality time with the grandchildren. So we started Meemaw and Peepaw Camp. This has become a highlight for us and the grandchildren. 2 requirements to come to camp. You must be at least 4 years old and you must be potty trained. This camp is a week set aside where the grandchildren come and spend time at our home. We make them t-shirts every year and run it similar to a camp. On Monday, when the children drop off the grandchildren, we all have supper together. Then the grandchildren put on their camp shirts, and we all stand on the front porch to wave goodbye to their parents. Thus, Meemaw Peepaw Camp officially begins. And this is the picture from one just a few weeks ago. And notice that they have a new shirt this year, and it has a mask on the rooster. Peepaw wakes them up each morning with a rooster crow and a song. We line them up for breakfast and start the activities. We have a destination each day, maybe a park, maybe the zoo. We eat lunch somewhere. And we'll build things together. The girls will have a tea party. We have a trampoline. We have supper in the evening and special talks with the grandchildren. Meemaw takes the girls and Peepaw takes the boys. And we have heartfelt discussions in a relaxed atmosphere. One night we will take a projector outside. We'll shoot a movie on the side of the house. The boys will go frog gigging. On the last night of camp, we'll fry up the frog legs and the fish they've caught through the week. It's become such a great thing in our lives and the lives of our grandchildren. Our oldest grandchild will still come at 18 years old. She told us she hoped we were still doing this when she had children so they could come as well. It takes some work and some planning, and the activities don't have to be something that costs a lot of money. It's opened up so many one-on-one conversations. We have an opportunity to strengthen the things their parents are teaching them and to emphasize the importance of knowing God and His will for their lives. We have laughed together, cried together, and tightened the bonds of family. We hope God gives us the health and strength to do this for our great-grandchildren as well. Wow, what a story. Every time I tell that, I think, good night, that is something. My guess is that stories from that week will be told for generations to come, and that's exactly what God wants to happen. The letter R. Reach the hearts of your children, their mates, and your grandchildren in that order. Malachi 4:6 points out that a key ministry of John the Baptist would be to turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers. When you see that word fathers, it would refer to both fathers and grandfathers. Grandparents, do your grandchildren see and feel and know that your heart is turned toward them? Do you smile at them, listen to them, and praise them? If so, their heart will probably turn toward you. Now, you know, I've been mostly serious up to this point, but the truth is this: grandchildren are a blast, aren't they? They are so much fun. You never know what they're going to say. My father-in-law lives with us, and my grandson Locke, his great-grandson, was sitting on Dad's lap. This is the actual picture where it happened. And Locke looked up at him and said, "Poppy, did you know that you got spider webs in your nose?" And then he said, "In fact, I think I see a spider in there right now." Then he said, he poked Daddy in the, Papa, he poked Dad in the belly, and he said, "Is there a baby inside there?" Now, this is, I'm talking about reaching the hearts of your children. Read off the screen with me, everybody, would you please? The most important ingredient in being a good grandparent is to get your children and grandchildren's hearts early. Be extremely vigilant to not lose their hearts. And if and when you ever do lose their heart, do anything you have to do to win their heart back. Think right now about each of your children, still at home or grown and on their own. Now think about their mates, each husband, each wife. Do you have their hearts? Have you done anything that you should not have done that would cause you to lose their hearts? Stop thinking about what they did. You can't control that. What have you done that would drive their heart away or draw their heart to you? Are you smiling and listening and praising? When your face and eyes smile, you draw the heart. When you frown and get angry, you drive the heart away. When you listen, you draw the heart. When you ignore or are too busy to pay attention, then you drive the heart away. You don't have to throw that phone away, but you do have to listen when your grandchild speaks to you. Listen and answer when they ask questions. God likes it when children ask questions. Remember Jesus asking questions at age 12 in the temple in Jerusalem. And in Joshua 4, God told the leaders of Israel to pick up a stone when they crossed the river so their children would later ask, what mean you by, why are these stones here? Say these three words, everybody, would you please? Smile and listen and praise. Say it again. Smile and listen and praise. When you praise, you draw the heart. When you attack or criticize, you drive the heart away. You cannot be a better parent or grandparent than you are a smiler. If you're not a good smiler, you're not a good grandpa. I'm just telling you. If you don't light up when you see your daughter-in-law or grandchildren, you're not a good grandma. We have all kinds of excuses why we attack and criticize and fuss and frown, and many of them are legitimate. So how's that working out for you? Has it made the children or grandchildren better people? Has it made you someone they want to be around? The letter O. Open the eyes and minds of grandchildren with stories of God's greatness. In Psalm 78, God is speaking to 4 generations. Look at this. Our fathers, their children, the children which should be born, and their children. Verse 4 seems to be the key verse in that passage. We will not hide them from their children, showing the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works which He hath done. Then that chapter is full of Bible stories that God wants your grandchildren to know. How God led the children of Israel out of Egypt, parted the Red Sea. God led them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, gave them manna to eat, water from a rock to drink, sent the 10 plagues on Egypt, smote all the firstborn, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. Then tell your own stories of how God led you and your wife and how God saved you, provided for you, delivered you, answered prayers for you. Psalm 145 verse 3, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and His greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall praise Thy works to another and shall declare Thy mighty acts. I agree with Josh Mulvihill when he says the key word of grandparents is, the key word for grandparents, what is it? I think it is heritage. Psalm 16:6, the lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. I remember visiting the grave of my great-great-great-grandpa, who was, the tombstone says it right there, who was a Baptist minister over 50 years, and he lived till 1880. If the heritage we're leaving our children doesn't include Jesus, then that heritage is lacking. Proverbs 19 says, house and riches are the inheritance of fathers, but if the only thing you leave your children and grandchildren is real estate and money, you really hadn't left them much. In fact, if they don't have wisdom, you will destroy them by leaving them money. When the children of Israel were not wise at Kadesh Barnea, God kept them from their inheritance. Our lives are all short, but a spiritual heritage can extend far beyond our lives. Number 4, wisely emphasize the priority of wisdom. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. Why does God say that? Because if your child gets the best education the world can offer and does not get wisdom, his life will be a failure. What's the difference? Knowledge is knowing things, stuff, details, options. Read with me, everybody, would you please? Wisdom is knowing what to do with knowledge and when and how to do it. Better a little knowledge with a lot of wisdom than a lot of knowledge and a little wisdom. Better a fourth grade education with wisdom than a master's degree without. Knowledge is knowing what words can be said. Wisdom is knowing whether or not to say them and when and how to say them. What good is a lot of medical knowledge if you use it to destroy the lives of babies instead of saving them? There are some smart doctors in abortion clinics, and they're not only killing babies, they're wasting their own lives. What good is knowledge about government if you use it to destroy liberty? There are some smart dictators in this world. What good is technological knowledge if you use it to steal from people? Wisdom is seeing life like the God who made life sees it. Like a mechanic understands how a car works, so God perfectly understands how life works. And a wise person gets wisdom from God to understand how life works. Watch me here. Wisdom sees problems and then calculates what will happen if this is done, or this is done, or this is done. Only wisdom can give true, precise answers to man's problems. When young King Solomon was confronted by 2 women who each claimed one living baby as her baby, he could not order a DNA test, but he had the wisdom to know that a loving mother would give up her baby before she would allow it to be put to death. Read off the screen, everybody, would you please? I lack wisdom. I need to ask God for wisdom. Grandparents, say over and over to your grandchildren that wisdom is the main thing. You can't be happy without it. You can't be a success without it. And how do you get it? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I go on walks with my grandchildren and I say to them, who made the trees, the sky? And they say, Jesus. And then I say, who made you? To fear the Lord is to stand in awe of His power, His love, His care. By the way, you will never emphasize creation too much. The biggest problems we're dealing with in America right now all go back to the false teaching of evolution. All of it. Where does communism and socialism come from? It comes from evolution. Where does atheism come from? It comes from evolution. Every major problem you've got goes back to a violation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. I beg people everywhere I go, don't let your children sit underneath any teacher who does not believe in creation. Here's my points. Commit yourself to making a positive spiritual impact on the life of each grandchild. Reach the hearts of your children, their mates, and your grandchildren in that order. Open the eyes and minds of grandchildren with stories of God's greatness. Wisely emphasize the priority of wisdom. And read this, everybody, would you please? Never quit and never lose a multi-generational vision. Paul said, I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord the righteous judge shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love His appearing. Notice that word crown again. And notice that Paul was determined to finish. To finish, I love this graphic. To finish means you never quit. The proper attitude for the Christian life is that he can't and won't ever just give up. Yes, there's a time to die. No, there is never a time to just give up. 21 years ago, after heart surgery and 4 weeks in the hospital, Audrey Cox's kidneys failed and she had to go on dialysis. Then it didn't work and it made her terribly sick, and she looked at me in the hospital room and said, Pastor Davis, is it wrong for me to refuse other treatments so I can just go to heaven? I'm not afraid to die. I'm just tired of being sick. With her husband Cletus of many years by her side, I said, God, I'm their pastor. They've asked a question I can't answer. They need an answer. Please give me the answer. And God seemed to clear my thinking. And I looked at him and said, I don't think you have enough information to make your decision. Is there a solution to these problems that's keeping the dialysis from working? What's the doctor's best guess? Once you find that out, then a couple of other thoughts. First, it's easier, listen to this, folks, don't anybody miss this. It's easier for you to die than it is on those you leave behind. You need to think not just about yourself, but about those you're leaving behind. And secondly, if you realize you probably can't get better, and you and your husband talk about it and agree that it's not God's will for you to continue those treatments, you don't make that decision because you're discouraged. You make that decision from a joyful heart that senses the work God gave you to do on earth is finished. I read to her 2 Corinthians 4:8 and told her she could be troubled but not distressed, perplexed but not in despair. And then 6 of us joined hands around the bed, that was before COVID, and gave it to God. And Sister Cox traded in a discouraged heart for a joyful heart and went on to live quite a while after that. In fact, that picture was taken at our church after the story I just told you. Psalm 71:8 is a key verse. Grandparents, you should have this verse up in your home. This is the verse for grandparents, in my opinion. When I'm old and gray-headed, oh God, forsake me not, until I have showed thy strength unto this generation and thy power to everyone that is to come. I gave this verse to a 65-year-old man who's got cancer, and I said, brother, get a hold of that verse. Hold on to that verse. Somebody overheard a 6-year-old girl praying. The little girl said, dear God, if you decide you need my grandma in heaven, please check with me first. Do not ever allow yourself to lose a sense of purpose in life. Caleb was 85 when he said to Joshua, give me this mountain. You are as young as your vision. Every person here should be seeking to have an impact on the next generation. I say to my 90-year-old father-in-law, who's lived with us now for 5 years, and we love it. We get along great. And he talks about going to heaven, and he spends 5 hours a day praying. I said, I'm glad you're going to heaven. I'm glad you want to go. But I don't want you leaving here early. It's a one-way trip, and you can't come back here after you leave here. Grandpa Earl Gibbs had just told his grandson, David, that he had bought a farmer's cattle too cheap. Has Brother Gibbs told this story here? How many here have heard this story? Let me see your hands. All right, those who hadn't. Those who have will like it. And by the way, I found like 3 or 4 different places where Brother Gibbs told this story online, and only one place did I find the key part of the story to me. How many of you know how much money was in that envelope? He apparently doesn't usually tell it. And to me, that was huge, huge. Anyway, he said, I put my money in this envelope. I want you to travel to their farm, get there before they go to bed tonight, tell them we're sorry we don't do this to people. We wouldn't want anybody to do this to us. He hands me this envelope, and I asked how much money is in there, and Grandpa said, about $35,000. I calculated out. You know what that would be like in 2020? That would be an envelope with over $200,000 cash in it. I put a little premium in there for them because I want them to understand we're Christians. All the way there, I kept asking myself, would I do this? When I got there, it was dark and the snow was flying, and I went up and knocked on the door, and the farmer's wife pulled the curtain back, looked out. The farmer came, they opened the door. I said, my name is Dave Gibbs, and my granddad Earl Gibbs said we bought your cattle too cheap. We're Christians. We don't do that. We want to make it right. He doesn't want you to go to bed tonight worried about it. I handed her the money. They opened the envelope, looked at the money, and the woman began to cry so hard she got a nosebleed. And I'll never forget what she said next. She turned to her husband and said, what kind of man does this? And her husband looked at her and said, a Christian, honey, a real Christian. And Dave Gibbs said, that's my granddad. He is a Christian. And all the way back, those words rang in my mind. I made a trip like that a number of times in my life. And my granddad sent other people to do it many times. And everywhere I went, they said, your granddad's that Christian man, isn't he? When my grandfather died, we had a viewing from 1 o'clock till 8 o'clock. We were going to have the funeral the next morning, but they had to postpone the funeral because thousands of people showed up, and for 2 days people kept walking through. We were in Ohio. Farmers came from Texas, California, Montana, Idaho, everywhere. Our competitors showed up. For 3 days I stood there as people came up to me and said, let me tell you about your granddad. It was one story after another. The lady I took the money to, they came through. She brought her grandchildren. She said, I wanted my grandchildren to see this man. I've talked about him so much. I wanted them to see him. She came up and hugged my neck and said to me, Mr. Gibbs, be like your granddad. Be real. Get what he had. You said he was getting it from God. Make sure you get it as well. May I suggest to you that Earl Gibbs' grandchildren in their hearts were casting a crown in their granddad's casket as they experienced the reality of Proverbs 17:6. Read it, please, everybody. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. I am a 69-year-old father of 4, grandfather of 16, great-grandfather of 4 more. I don't deserve that crown, but I want it.